Quill Kukla is Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University. They've published on a broad range of topics, including some widely discussed papers on slurs, discursive justice, pregnancy and breastfeeding, gender attribution, and urban spaces. They are the author of several books, the latest one being Sex Beyond Yes, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone. I just started reading, I needed to stop myself. And today's lecture is entitled Healthism, Neurodiversity, and Respectability Politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Quill Kukla. Thank you so much for coming.
Is this a decent level for this microphone? Are we good? Okay, excellent. This invitation came a long time ago, and I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time, so it's exciting to finally be here. Thank you for having me. I'm gonna start with two little apologies. One is the original version of this talk that I gave in the title for was just unmanageably long, and so I've trimmed it back a little bit. And the title has lost the ISM. So it's now just Health, Neurodiversity, and Respectability Politics, because I'm not going to talk about the healthism part as much. But otherwise, it'll be mostly the same talk. So that's one apology. The other apology is a little bit odd. I had a strange medical event over the weekend, and I'm experiencing some facial paralysis. And so it's not affecting my voice very much, but it is affecting my eyes a little bit and my voice a bit. So if I look weird, please be patient with me. It'll even itself out, okay? So thank you. Okay, let's go. So I wanna start out by talking about the connection between neurodiversity and health. And I'll say right off of the bat, most of this talk is gonna focus on autism. I'm gonna focus a little bit on ADHD too, but then I'm gonna sometimes broaden out and talk about neurodiversity more generally. So neurodivergent conditions, including autism and ADHD, are almost always framed and managed through a health lens, which is to say they're taken as pathologies that should be treated, and they are embedded within the health system, broadly construed. A little bit of evidence for this. The most recent versions of DSM list autism as a thing that can be diagnosed, right? Diagnosis is a thing that we reserve for health conditions. That is a book of health conditions. If you look at national and international health websites, such as the WHO website, the NHS website, I don't want to look at CDC and NIH right now, but up until recently, those websites, they will each have a section on having autism. So that both indicates that they count it as under the health rubric, that it's on the site of all, but also the phrasing, having autism, where it doesn't really prove that it's being treated as a disease or a pathology, but we tend to reserve that grammar of having X for things that we take to be an illness or a disease. I very much enjoy reading scientific scholarly articles as texts. It's sort of the STS side of me. And one thing that I've noticed that's quite interesting is that some scientific fields get these little like rhetorical tics that become almost mandatory. And if you read any scientific article on autism, it's become basically mandatory that somewhere in the first paragraph or two, you use a sentence where you call autism a devastating disease. Like it kind of doesn't matter what you say next, but like they have to start by saying autism is a devastating disease. But if you think about it for even a moment, you'll notice that it's not that clear in what sense these are health conditions, right? They're certainly not standard morbidities, and they raise a question about what health means in this context, right? So I'm gonna argue a few things. I'm gonna argue that when it comes to neurodiversity, health is implicitly and sometimes explicitly defined in terms of respectability and productivity and social non-disruptiveness. That's a descriptive claim. Furthermore, I'm going to make a more normative claim, which is that defining individual health in terms of social palatability and others' needs rather than in terms of people's own flourishing, is both ethically troubling and conceptually troubling. And that trying to treat neurodivergent people by turning them into non-disruptive, efficient members of productivity culture is likely to backfire and do harm, not only to them, but to society at large. I will argue that a health framework for thinking about neurodiversity is mostly inappropriate, although I'm going to qualify that at the end. And I'm going to claim that neurodiversity is more productively understood as an epistemological and communicative difference that affects, in particular, attention and social interaction. Okay, so just on the face of it, is autism a health problem? Why does it get classified as a health problem? It's certainly true, like I said, now I'm going to focus on autism for a while. I'll broaden back out later. Certainly, autism can lead to health problems fairly regularly, including anxiety, depression, self-harm, certain kinds of risk-taking, proneness to addiction and substance abuse. And it also often co-travels with more traditional health problems, including GERD and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, among other things. But autism itself is not in any clear, recognizable sense an illness or a loss of function, and there's no direction to mortality. There's also, importantly, no cure. There's, of course, plenty of health problems that have no cure, so that's not dispositive in and of itself, but it's significant. It's also very clear that in suitable contexts, autistic people can flourish without apparent dysfunction or suffering. According to many autistic advocates, I would say most autistic advocates, autism should be understood as a difference with its own value, and autistic ways of thinking and living should be seen as adding valuable diversity to society. Now, that's true even if, or even though, I would say, autism does come with clear disadvantages and challenges. I don't think there's any denying that autism is a disability, but I think it's important that not every disadvantage or challenge or disability is a health problem, right? Not everything bad should be subsumed under a health framework. I'm going to claim that autistic people's main problem is that they make neurotypical people uncomfortable and don't follow their respectability and efficiency norms. And this, of course, in turn has costs for them as well. In order to start to build this case, it helps to look at some of the official definitions of autism. So I'm going to go off of DSM here. These are not interpretations. This is wording right from DSM. One thing that's interesting about official definitions of autism and the varieties of autism is that they uniformly focus not on the individual, but on interactions between the individual and other people, viewed, I'm going to argue, specifically from a neurotypical point of view. So in order to be clinically diagnosed as having autism, you need to meet 3 necessary conditions, and then there's a long list of other markers of which you have to have at least 2, but you don't have to have all of them. It's kind of a messier list. And the 3 things you have to have are the 3 I have up here. You have to have difficulties. This is the wording from DSM, which is going to be important for me in a moment. Difficulties in social reciprocity, conversation, expressing emotions, and sharing interests. Difficulties in nonverbal communication used for social interaction. Difficulties in developing and maintaining relationships with others. And then there's a whole list of other markers that include things like having special interests, intense focus, sensory sensitivities, a bunch of others that you're supposed to have some of. What I want you to notice first is that all 3 of these main necessary criteria are actually symmetrical problems, which, if they had been described from an autistic point of view rather than a neurotypical point of view, could have just as accurately have been described as neurotypical people having these difficulties with autistic people, right? From within the neurodiversity affirming literature, this is called the double empathy problem. It takes 2 people to have difficulties with reciprocity, and it takes 2 people to have difficulties with communication. So describing this as a one-sided problem is to take a specific perspective on the problem, right? This is especially true given that there's a very small, and I would say at this point quite weak, often based on very small sample sizes or even anecdotal studies, but there is growing research showing that autistic people do not particularly have these difficulties with one another. So this is a problem about communication between autistic people and neurotypical people. Drilling down a little farther to make this case more, there have been multiple attempts within a diagnostic framework to define an official hierarchy of autistic people. We've tried this over and over again. All of these have been about ranking autistic people in terms of how disruptive they are to neurotypical culture and to other people, and how well they can or can't fit in with productivity culture. So originally, the most famous example of this is we distinguished between normal autistic people and people with Asperger's syndrome, right? This has been eliminated from DSM. It's not a legitimate diagnosis hardly anywhere anymore. Asperger's was very literally a category that was come up with by a Nazi doctor, and I don't just mean a doctor who happened to be working in Nazi Germany, I mean a doctor who was directly working for the Nazis. And he wanted a category for the good autistic people who could still be useful and productive and therefore could be integrated into the Volk instead of killed. The label is still commonly used, interestingly, never by autistic people or almost never by autistic people, but when you still hear Asperger's being used, it's when parents of autistic people, who famously have often a quite different agenda from autistic people themselves, want to flag that their kid is not one of those like disruptive, uncomfortable autistic people, but one of the good ones. They will say, oh, they have Asperger's. Anyhow, that got scrapped as a diagnosis, and it was replaced with functioning labels. So we started diagnosing people as high-functioning autistics versus low-functioning autistics. This is actually the one that philosophically and sort of emotionally interests me most. High-functioning autistic people are defined as those who can do what neurotypical culture demands, such as hold normal jobs and so forth. It is not defined in terms of their own needs or well-being. And the thing that really brought this home for me and actually kind of originally got me interested in this paper is I saw a series of studies, quite good studies, quite recent studies, showing that autistic people who have been diagnosed as high-functioning actually have higher rates, significantly higher rates of both anxiety and depression than low-functioning autistic people. And that should really make you pause and ask, high-functioning for whom and for what purpose, right? If they're less happy and more stressed out, the justification for calling them high-functioning deserves some reflection. This was scrapped because it was also seen as elitist and problematic, and it was replaced with the current system, which I think is a tiny bit better, but really has the same basic structure. We now talk about level 1, 2, and 3 for autistic people. Level 1 autistic people are defined as those who have low support needs when it comes to functioning socially. There's a few things to say about this. First of all, everybody in the world almost has very high support needs. Unless you happen to be one of these survivalists who grows your own food and makes your own shelter by hand, you are a high support needs person in order to function socially, right? You rely on supermarkets and these chairs and buses and houses being built for you and refrigeration and any number of other things. We are all high support needs. So all that this can possibly mean is that the support needs are statistically atypical, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with having high support needs. Another point here is that babies have statistically atypical, very high support needs, and we don't count them as pathological, right? Furthermore, this classification, just like the others, what it really does ultimately is it just measures autistic people's difference from the norm and the extent to which they can simulate neurotypical functioning without being a disruptive presence. I think it might also signal how much social resources we see them as taking up. In short, all these different attempts to officially rank autistic people have been rejected by autism advocacy groups. They've been seen as encouraging both hierarchy and ableism, and measuring autistic people in terms of how disruptive they are to neurotypical people and neurotypical culture. Now, the fact of the matter is, autistic people and ADHD people, who I'll bring back in now, and by the way, there's increasing evidence that these are not actually two neatly separable conditions, huge overlap between them. I suspect that in 30 years we will have different labels and they won't be separated in the same way. But in any case, it's true that both autistic and ADHD people are in fact often disruptive, right? They often do not behave respectably according to neurotypical cultural norms. So some of the standard ways that they can behave non-respectably or disruptively: non-standard eye contact, not performing emotions in socially expected ways, violating the social norms of conversation. So for example, not knowing exactly when to start a conversation or when to stop a conversation, or how to do conventional turn switching or when to switch topics. These are all problems that autistic and ADHD people share. Stimming, which most of you probably know what that is, but it's any sort of repetitive self-regulation or self-soothing motion. Failing to start and stop activities according to other people's timing expectations. So both problems with activation and then problems with task squishing on the other end. Extremely high rates of both queer and trans people. This is coming out more and more, really just staggeringly high rates of queer and trans people among autistic people, which is, at least in society as we are now, inherently disruptive to some extent, right? And then this last one, as a philosopher, I find especially interesting. It's particularly autistic people not experiencing social conventions as natural, right? Most neurotypical people, as they grow up, they internalize social conventions, and so at a certain point, those social conventions don't even feel like conventions anymore. They just feel like how your body automatically responds, and they don't seem to need justification. Many autistic people don't experience social conventions as natural, but have to explicitly think about them, and this means that they don't necessarily take them as either easy to follow or worth following, because it's much easier to ask why you're supposed to be following a social convention if you haven't internalized it, right? Notice that none of these things are inherently harmful or dysfunctional for the individuals who do them, right? But, and this is legitimate, within a highly coordinated bureaucratic division of labor, which is what we all live in, these behaviors do in fact lead to inefficiency and disruptiveness. And furthermore, if you're within a system that rewards conventional behavior, they can make functioning difficult and make other people uncomfortable. Now, here's really the turning point in my talk. Well, it's one of a couple. I want to propose that neurodivergence, this is not a definition. I'm not giving an essence. This isn't the whole story. But I want to propose that neurodivergence can often very productively be understood as attentional difference. I think this is true for autism, ADHD, but other neurodivergences too, such as OCD and dyslexia. And I want to suggest that this is a framing that's just outside of a health framework altogether, even though there are attentional differences that might also be health problems. So it's not like it has to be one or the other. But this attentional framing is just a different framing. Now, we kind of already knew this, right? There's an old school view, which turns out to be very wrong, but we all sort of remember it, where ADHD is not enough attention and autism is too much attention, right? In fact, the not enough attention is built right into the name. The AD stands for attention deficit. But, and we have a stereotype of ADHD people as just absolutely unable to attend and distractible. We also have a stereotype of autistic people as sort of hyper-focused on one particular thing that they can't get off, right? So we have this sort of vague idea in the culture that these conditions have something to do with attention. But that's a very old school view, and I think it's dramatically too simple and in fact wrong. However, there are systematic attentional differences that go along with these conditions. So for example, both of them can involve hyperfocus, which is attention that is very solid and hard to break. Monotropism and hyperfocus are often confused, but they're not quite the same. Monotropism is the screening out of external stimuli so that they recede into the background. Special interests, this one is a little bit more associated with autism, although we're more and more realizing it's an ADHD thing as well, right? Which is unlimited attention for particular topics, or effectively unlimited attention for certain topics. Time blindness, which is an inability to pay attention to how much time has passed. This is especially an ADHD thing. Distractibility, where your attention is easily captured by a new topic or stimulus. This is especially an ADHD thing. This one doesn't have a good name. It gets called sensory processing disorder. I think that the disorder language begs the question, even though this can be a very painful condition to have, but I'm going to call it hyperperceptivity instead to just be a little more neutral. And this is the tendency to take in a huge swath of the environment without screening out what would be background for neurotypical people. And finally, non-standard salience, right? The tendency to notice patterns or categories or details that would be in the background for neurotypical people. This one is also a bit of a stereotype about autistic people. Okay, so there's this whole slew of attentional differences. And behind those, I want to claim that there are two basic types of attentional motors. This is fun because I'm going to do a little thought experiment with you in a moment, and everybody enjoys it. The names of these two are basically self-explanatory. There's interest-based attention and there's needs-based attention. Virtually everybody on Earth has both, but the proportions in which you have them might vary a lot, and your ability to switch between them and which one turns on in which context might vary a lot, right? So interest-based attention is attending to what captures your interest in the present. Needs-based attention is attending to what you need to attend to in order to control future consequences and meet future needs. And we all need to have both of these in order to be fully functional. But for most of us, one of them is dominant. So here's a little thought experiment that I want you to do right now. I want you to think about times when you really wish you were attending to something, but you're failing. I'm not talking about things you don't want to attend to. I'm talking about when you wish that you were attending something. I'm assuming we've all had this experience, right? Like you're in a talk and you want to be paying attention, but your attention is wandering, or you're trying to get through some boring task and you want to be attending and you don't. Okay, so if you're having trouble attending and you're trying to motivate yourself and try to get yourself to attend, what's your go-to strategy? Do you go over in your head how dire and terrible it will be if you fail to attend and how important it is that you attend and the consequences of you not doing so, right? Or do you try to find a way to shift the situation in order to make the task more interesting to yourself? You've probably done both, but I bet that you have a go-to, right? Some people are just like, oh my God, if I don't do this, everything's going to be terrible, and that's how they try to focus. And some people are like, how can I play around with this situation to make it interest me? Autistic people and ADHD people very often have extremely strong interest-based attention and very minimal capacity for needs-based attention. And this means that future rewards and punishments often don't motivate neurodivergent people. And here's a key point, even if they really want them to, right? It's not that they don't care about the future consequences. That's not the issue at all. They may sit there being super miserable that they know that they are bringing upon themselves terrible future consequences by not attending, and yet that doesn't actually shift their attention, right? What drives attention for them, and hence what drives motivation and action, is present, engaged interest. And it's really important to me to emphasize that this isn't the same as not caring about the consequences. Moving even farther back, one step more abstractly, I want to claim that neurotypical productivity culture strongly presumes and privileges needs-based attention as the basic way it organizes things, right? It motivates behavior via incentives and punishments and gamification. These are all strategies used to get people to do things that are based on needs-based attention, right? Like if you do this now, you'll get points later, and you can use them for stuff later. It tries to capture attention by making various needs actually be, or at least appear to be, more dire than they actually are, right? Artificially ramping up the consequences. As a culture, we tend to treat long-range planning and task switching according to need as a virtue, right? Like not just as something useful, but as like what good, productive, well-disciplined people do. And backing up even more, this last one comes from, I gave this talk, a version of this talk in Paris a couple months ago, and somebody in the audience afterwards was like, well, basically this is just Nietzsche, right? It's like a culture of suffer now and be rewarded later. And I thought that was actually a really good point. Okay, now I'm going to take what's going to seem like a detour, but I promise I'm going to bring it all back together. Let me just check how I'm doing for time. Okay, I'm doing great. Okay. I want to talk for a few minutes about clock time versus crypt time. So Sarah Hendren, who is this wonderful scholar, she's a design engineer who also specializes in disability. And she wrote a wonderful book called What a Body Can Do, strongly recommended. It's a nice, easy read, really interesting. She argues that productivity culture relies on what she calls clock time. There's actually a point here that once you hear it is crashingly obvious, but we don't talk about it very often. So we all grew up at some point learning about differentiated labor, right? The reason that humans can do really complicated things like build bridges and run governments and so on is we have a system of differentiated labor where different people do different tasks, and those tasks are coordinated and organized and come together into bigger things, right? We all know that, right? But this is an obvious point, but we just don't make it explicit that often. That whole system of differentiated labor also requires temporal coordination. Because it's not just that each person can go off and do their own little task. Their little tasks have to be coordinated with one another temporally in order to all fit together in the right way, right? So labor is organized not just by our having different tasks from one another, but by syncing our timing and pace. And this is true for everything from factories to bureaucratic offices and many, many things in between. She argues that efficiency and respectability require sharing a clock. And this shared clock coordinates and regulates our attention and our action. And if we violate the shared clock, it's disruptive and inefficient. This next point is mine, not hers. I think a really nice way of thinking about this point is to say that productivity culture and respectability culture call for a choreography of attention that is coordinated by the shared clock. I love the word choreography here, right? Because in a choreography, it's not just that you have to memorize your own steps. You have to coordinate those steps with other people's steps. Otherwise, it's not a choreography, right? Now, in a clock time environment, interest-based attention, being really dominated by interest-based attention, can be a serious disability, right? If you have difficulty shifting tasks on cue and meeting deadlines and completing boring tasks, it's going to be very hard for you to keep up with that choreography. Is my mic okay? It sounds sort of like weird and watery. Do I sound normal? Okay, good. So it seriously is a disability in that environment. Now, there's another concept. This is not from Sarah Hendren. This is one that's been floating around in the disability studies and disability advocacy worlds for quite a while, and that's the concept of crypt time. Crypt time is a concept that recognizes that, in fact, people vary in their pacing and their temporality, and that a lot of valuable creative activity is not necessarily done on shared clock time. Now, I want to make it clear, I am not against clock time. and the culture of clock time because it's how a lot of stuff that we need to get done gets done. We can't just scrap it. We do, in fact, need many, many people to be on clock time, but we don't need everyone to be on clock time, and it's perfectly consistent with lots of people needing to be on clock time, that other forms of action and attention are also important and valuable. So an analogy here that I like is that the world really needs doctors and healthcare professionals, right? And if we didn't have any doctors and healthcare professionals, we'd be in big trouble. But that's literally zero criticism of people who are doing things other than being doctors and healthcare professionals, right? We just need a bunch of them. We don't need everybody to do that, and it's no worse to be doing something else. However, Hendren points out that violating clock time is heavily stigmatized. In English, the worst ableist slur that you can use, the worst word that the language has with ableist connotations, I don't even like saying it in the talk, but I need to make my point, is the word retarded. And it's really interesting to think about the fact that retarded is a temporal insult, right? The worst thing you can be is temporally behind. This quote from Sarah Hendren, whenever I read it, it actually kind of stresses me out. She says, the pace set in contemporary, she's not talking about neurodiversity, by the way, that's not her topic. She's just talking about disability more generally. But she says, the pace set in contemporary schools and workplaces presumes a form of able-bodied productivity, an ideal of speed and efficiency. That's not a literal clock, but the one in the background, invisible yet always ticking. It's a mismatch for all kinds of people because it's not simply a timepiece, it's an economic instrument. The body and mind are a combined organism with infinite complexity, but the measures at hand are those of the clock. Whether and how the social cognitive mind and body of a person is checking off the milestones for a given set of skills in a timely way. I don't know why, but this idea that there's this like giant clock back there controlling and measuring and judging me extra stresses me out. However, the idea that we should regulate our bodies and our activities to this shared clock is rarely questioned. Like pretty much all of us, if we're out of sync with the clock, we feel bad about ourselves. Like not just stressed, but like we failed, right? So neurodivergent attention then is stigmatized and disruptive in the context of productivity culture. But I want to argue that it also has some obvious epistemic advantages. Again, remember my doctor analogy. I'm not saying everybody should be not on clock time. I'm saying it's good to have some people who are not on clock time, right? So for example, hyperfocus can lead to really deep research and a drive to continue that research. Hyperperceptivity can be very painful. Like I said, it can lead to sensory overwhelm, but it can also lead to the discovery of significant patterns. It can lead to intense creativity. It can lead to aesthetic joy or the creation of aesthetic joy for others. Special interests can lead to really deep expertise. And they can lead to the ability to stick out a project past the official need, right? If you're very needs-based in your attention, then once you've met the need, right? Once people are like, okay, you've done enough, then it's hard to keep your attention going. But if you have this kind of special interest, then well past the point where you've met whatever bar, you may keep going. And that can obviously lead to really important discoveries or really important epistemic contributions. The next one is really important to me. I think that the tendency of neurodivergent people to focus on the wrong things, right? Patterns that are supposed to be in the background or not supposed to be what's salient, can really help us to see through ideology and question presuppositions, right? Because if you're focusing on the stuff that doesn't usually get focused on, it can make you ask why the stuff that's taken for granted is taken for granted. And this is important to notice. Neurotypical culture does not just demand certain forms of attention, it also suppresses certain forms of attention. In particular, it directs attention away from questions about why various social norms and conventions are in place in the first place. But if you have non-standard attention and non-standard salience, then that suppression may not work for you. So oftentimes neurodivergent people can really be in an especially good position to critique norms that are taken for granted. There's a paper by Georgie Gardner where she argues that there is an objective truth of the matter about what we should pay attention to. She says we should pay attention to what objectively matters. And her example I find very interesting. She says that, for example, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, you're supposed to pay attention to the art and not to the bathrooms. The art is the important thing. And I was thinking about this example. I've been to the Louvre and I've enjoyed it. It is cool. But there's a few things to notice about it. Like, so first of all, by the time I went, I'm not much one for thinking about, like, I'm not that impressed with, like, the authenticity of the original object being in front of me. Most of the things in the Louvre I had already seen reproduced over and over and over again in my life. I will admit it's cooler seeing them in person, but you know, there were limits to how cool it was. Also, talk about a choreography of attention, right? You go to a place like the Louvre and everybody is attending in exactly the same way. There are ropes and signs and docents there to make sure that you're attending in the same way, and everybody follows along and follows everybody else's lead as to how to attend, right? Including, like, when you get to the Mona Lisa, there's a long line and people stand in line and they walk up to the appropriate attentional distance and they stand in front of it for about the 20 seconds, which is, you know, 20 or 30 seconds, which is socially acceptable. And then they move and the next person does the same thing, right? So that could be cool, but one thing that seems clearly true is that there's no new insights being gotten, right? Everybody is attending to the same thing in the same way. Nothing new is happening. Not knocking it, very cool. But I didn't pay attention to the bathrooms in the Louvre, but it seems to me completely possible that paying attention to the bathrooms could give all sorts of new insights into, like, I don't know, gender, class, architecture, design. I don't know what. But it seems to me like there's maybe more possibility for learning something new paying attention to the bathrooms in the Louvre than being the, you know, 10 millionth person to stare at the same angle at the Mona Lisa for 20 seconds. So I want to claim that there is no objectively correct form of attention. And that's not to say that there's not better and worse attention. There are clearly norms of attention, and sometimes we really wish that our own attention could work differently, right? And we get mad at our attention because we're not as gently in control of it as we would like, and we would be better off if it were working a little bit differently. So I'm not denying that I'm not being like some sort of anything goes person about attention, but I don't think that there's a single objectively correct form of attention. I don't think that attentional differences inherently yield false beliefs or delusions, right? They're just showing you something different. They're not showing you something false. And they may provide valuable epistemic diversity. I would claim that neurodivergent attention can be good for specific kinds of tasks that require the various kinds of attentional differences I've talked about, including, for example, detective work, art, science, design. Guess what? Philosophy. We have, you may have noticed that there is huge selection bias in terms of how many neurodivergent people you meet in your line of work. There's a reason for that. And we kind of know this at a cultural level already, right? There tend to be media characters in these areas who are coded as neurodivergent. Okay, bringing back to health for the last bit of the paper that will wrap things together. Okay, so like I said, these things are generally treated through a health framework. What is the supposed treatment for autism? Well, the main treatment for autism is applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. This is given a strong medical framing. So if you look at websites like the CDC or the NHS, they will all describe ABA as again, it's like a tick, they all use the same language, as the frontline gold standard treatment for autism. In most countries, ABA is covered by health insurance, and it's generally the only thing that's covered by health insurance, right? It's the one and only thing. Parents who get a diagnosis of autism for their kid are heavily pressured to do ABA. I was going to talk a lot about healthism, but I've reduced it to this one point, right? If you find out that your child has a health problem, it goes very deep in our culture that you're not allowed to just like ignore that and say you don't care. You are responsible for taking care of that health problem. So in the name of being responsible for their children's health, there's an enormous amount of pressure on parents to put their kids in ABA. Now, there are 4 key points to make about ABA. These are not my interpretations. These are just directly part of the description of the method. First of all, it's explicitly designed to make social behavior more normal and less disruptive. The treatment goal of ABA is social respectability or appropriate social behavior. It's an operant conditioning approach that is focused on behavior modification and not on the inner experience of the patient. Again, this is explicit. And like all operant conditioning, it's based on a system of rewards for good behavior and punishments for bad behavior, where good behavior is defined as neurotypical behavior and bad behavior is defined as autistic behavior. It's extremely time intensive. It often requires hours of training a day for years, and relapse is very common. So when people stop doing ABA, they tend to revert to their old behaviors. It's considered a treatment in the name of health, but what I want you to notice, going back to the early part of my talk, is it's a treatment that is other-directed rather than self-directed. And here's where I think we really see this illusion of health with social respectability. The goal of ABA is respectable behavior, and most noticeably, the goal is not eliminating the experiences that typically actually distress autistic people and cause them suffering. For example, sensory overwhelm, sensory sensitivities, self-harm urges, and extreme anxiety during social interaction. Those are the things that autistic people actually feel as painful, but that's not the target, right? Subjective well-being is simply explicitly not a goal or a success criterion of ABA. Proponents of it say, well, maybe, but it works. But the question is, works to do what, right? So there have been a couple recent studies, very helpful for me, among autistic people who have done ABA, and I want you to really pay attention to these numbers. 62% strongly disagree, and 10% disagree that ABA should ever be used. 88% of autistic people oppose the use of ABA in all cases. And with that low of a satisfaction rate, you really need to question for whom it works and in what sense. What do we mean when we say it works, right? Like imagine we invented a knee replacement technique and 88% of people opposed ever using it, and whatever that comes to, 72% of the people who had it said that not only do they wish they'd not had it, but that nobody should ever have it. We would not count that as a treatment that worked. Why is it so terrible? What are some of the harms of ABA? Well, it's based on the premise that autism needs treatment and autistic ways of being should be eliminated. And many autistic people quite reasonably consider it a hate crime, analogous to gay and trans conversion therapy. It actually does have the same theoretical roots with the same team. But a little more concretely, it trains autistic people to hate and fear their own autistic traits and associate them with punishment, right? Almost Clockwork Orange style, right? It explicitly stigmatizes activities that bring joy, such as pursuing special interests and stimming, and it makes people associate those pleasurable things with negative reinforcement instead of with joy. We know that it can harm traditional health. There's very high rates of PTSD and depression after ABA. And we know that if you take away people's tools for self-regulation and for managing distress, like stims, this can cause anxiety, pain, self-harm, and often substance abuse. Slightly different, more qualitative study in 2023, autistic people who did ABA report very few benefits and believe that the treatment is unethical and don't believe that being made to behave normally is a valid treatment goal. Okay, but even if we give ABA its goals and don't criticize them for a moment, why is it so hard to get it to work by its own standards, right? Why does it take hours a day for years and then end in relapse? ABA is based on reward for neurotypical behaviors and punishment for autistic behaviors. But remember, I argued people with interest-based attention, like most autistic people, are bad at modifying their behavior on exactly that basis. They may know that a reward or a punishment is coming, but if the desired behavior doesn't interest or engage them, they can't attend to doing it. Again, even if they care and even if they want to. Some of you in this room probably have kids who have ADHD or autism, and you probably know that threatening punishment simply will not bring about a behavior that you want to bring about, like putting away the dishes or doing your homework or cleaning your room or whatever it is. If that behavior doesn't engage their interest and hence cannot engage their attention. The result is that when people do ABA, they often end up fearing punishment because they know it's coming and feeling anxious and upset and inferior because they're continuously failing this test of adjusting their behavior. But that doesn't necessarily thereby modify their behavior unless they're given like an immediate fear of torture, which is so immediate that it becomes interesting, which hopefully is not what we want as our standard of care. So I want to claim that operant conditioning as training for complex social behavior is itself based on a neurotypical model of attention. Okay, just a couple more slides and then I'm done. How am I doing for timing? Speaking of clock time. Okay, good. I'm a little over what I wanted, but not by much. I'll be done in less than 5 minutes. Okay, so if not ABA, what then? Because some of the things that autistic people do are genuinely harmful and risky. Right? What are better solutions to genuinely harmful or risky behavior? One is, and this is just counter to what ABA is about, understand the reasons underlying a behavior and find ways to change the environment to remove them. So for example, a lot of autistic kids and adults, but it's more scary when kids do it, elope, which means they just take off without warning. The ABA approach is to punish them for eloping. But why do they elope? Well, one big reason is sensory overload, right? The environment becomes too much. What you can do instead is you can offer quiet spaces, you can offer safe words for them to use when it's becoming too much, you can give them noise-canceling headphones. These things help with eloping. Another reason they elope is because they're sensory-seeking and novelty-seeking, and they're curious, so you can offer an environment with more variety. Another thing you can do is you can redirect an impulse that leads to a harmful, dangerous behavior to something that is equally interesting but harmless, rather than punishing the harmful behavior, right? So a lot of autistic kids have problems with biting because they're very sensory with their mouth. Instead of punishing biting, you can offer bite toys and chewy candy. My favorite one is, like, a lot of people know this, that a lot of autistic kids and some autistic adults will do serious self-harm because they'll bang their heads. That's because for some autistic people, the need for really extreme sensory stimulation is really high. They just want a ton of sensory stimulation. It turns out that a great solution for headbanging is to give them a trampoline and let them jump up and down. Great substitute, because it's very bodily, right? But both of these approaches require understanding people's experiences and motivations and desires and not just their external behavior. And key for my thesis in this talk, they do not aim at producing normal, socially appropriate, respectable social behavior, right? If you see some kid with noise-canceling headphones jumping up and down on a trampoline, they're not blending in. Okay, so am I saying that health is irrelevant to neurodivergence? No. Neurodivergence is often intertwined with health issues, such as, I've mentioned some of these, self-harm, substance abuse, and anxiety, but also, interestingly, with having difficulty with medical and hygiene routines, because those can be very needs-based rather than interest-based. But we can focus on treating these narrower problems rather than framing our approach as treating autism or treating ADHD. I love this following analogy that I came up with. I'm probably more proud of it than I should be, but I really love it. Being a gymnast, we know, comes along with a lot of very routine, like predictable health problems, right? Being a gymnast is hard on your body. There are specific health problems that gymnasts tend to have. And this doesn't make being a gymnast into a disease. When a gymnast has these health problems, we treat the health problems, and not only that, we treat them in the context of the fact that they're a gymnast, right? We understand what kind of treatment they need and what happened in the context of the fact that gymnastics is a thing that they do. But we don't treat the gymnasticism. I think similarly, we can treat health problems in the context of neurodivergence without taking ourselves as treating ADHD or treating autism. There are also a ton of social supports out there that can help autistic and ADHD people flourish, including within clock time culture, because fact is, we all need to do a lot of clock time culture, right? But these should not be thought of as health interventions, is my claim. And again, remember, something can be an intentional difference and a health condition, so sometimes we need both approaches. So, concluding thoughts. Other people's discomfort with someone should never be considered that person's health problem. And moreover, communication and social interaction breakdowns are inherently symmetrical. Producing respectable, non-disruptive social behavior is not a health matter. It's often very important. We often need to be able to do it to get by, but it's not a health matter. And enforcing social conformism is not health care. Having a different intentional structure is not in itself a pathology or a disease. It is rather, I would claim, a different epistemic mode of engagement, and one that doesn't have to be either more or less accurate or helpful than more traditional modes of engagement. And when we try to train neurodivergent people to act normal, it not only harms them, but it's going to end up suppressing socially valuable creativity, critical thinking, cognitive diversity, and deep knowledge. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your lecture. We now have about 30 minutes for discussion, and the floor is open. You have to make yourself noticeable to me. There is one question in the back.
You saw Jillian down here too, right? I don't think people know who you want to speak first.
Say again?
I think you need to call on somebody because they don't.
Okay, no. They already have the microphone.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. That was great, super interesting. I have two small questions. So the first of it is, do you think what you have just said applies to all externalizing disorders such as oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, kleptomania, pyromania, and so on? Or would you see a difference there? And the second question is, what do you think about ADHD medication in your framework? How would you frame what is happening there?
Right.
Is this a treatment or what?
So your first examples were, because I don't have the same response to all of them, your first examples were oppositional defiance disorder, kleptomania, and pyromania, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so first, I don't think kleptomania and pyromania are attentional disorders at all. I would not call them neurodivergences. I would call them other forms of mental illness. They're just not the same kind of thing. They're not about where your attention is. They're about a compulsion to do a particular thing, right? I don't believe in oppositional defiance disorder. That diagnosis has been mostly eliminated, but sometimes is still given out. To me, that's the ultimate example of like a neurotypical description of somebody else's behavior and making that behavior, defining that behavior in terms of the problem for somebody else rather than for the person. There's a similar diagnosis that is now sometimes given out, which is PDA, which originally stood for pathological demand avoidance and is now sometimes rewritten as persistent drive for autonomy. which I do think is, I don't think that's an attentional issue, but I do think it's another example of a case where it's been helpful to redefine the disorder in terms of the person's own flourishing and capacities rather than in terms of the problem that they're making for somebody else. So to me, the problem with conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, is it was entirely defined as other people's problems. Now, sometimes when I give a talk like this, people are like, well, what then is health? And I'm going to admit to you right now, like, I think that's an incredibly difficult question. I've written on what health is. I'm not even sure I agree with my past self. Philosophers keep failing to define what health is. So I don't have a fully developed theory of health to give you. But one thing I think health is, whatever else it is, it's about the flourishing of the individual. It's not about a problem you're causing for somebody else. Now, if you're causing a problem for somebody else, that does in turn cause a problem for you a lot of the time, right? But that's not a health problem. Like, not all problems are health problems. We can have other kinds of problems. So I would say kleptomania and pyromania are, standard mental disorders. I would put them in a health framework, but I don't think that they're attentional neurodivergences of the type that I'm talking about. And then, wait, there's a second half to your question. Medication. Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, so I think that medication for people with ADHD can be an enormous help. It can be an enormous help, especially if they need to be functioning in a clock time environment, right? But even if we loosen that up a lot, they're often just a really good they're really good support for ADHD people being able to do things that they actually want to do. Because remember, one of the things I said along the way, and I said it a couple times because it matters to me, is being unable to attend to something doesn't mean you don't care about the consequences, right? So oftentimes somebody with ADHD will want to be able to achieve those consequences and so want the help. I think, though, this is hard to do because of the way that medication is inserted within the institutions of medicine, that we should not think of that as a health intervention. We should think of it as a social support. Just because it comes in pill form to me, doesn't necessarily mean that it's best thought of as a health intervention. But no, I'm not anti-medication, but I'm definitely against something closely related, which is the idea that people with ADHD should be medicated whether or not they need to be so that they act like normal, non-destructive people, right? Like the question of whether somebody with ADHD needs medicine and when and how much and in what contexts is about what helps them actually function rather than getting them to be less disruptive and less of a problem given the larger, given the respectability standards around them. Yeah. But yeah, the medication question is a great one. Yeah.
Second question is over here.
Thanks, Quill. I found that really compelling.
Thanks.
One question I was left with, though, is sometimes it seemed as if you were suggesting there are two kinds of people, the autistic people, the non-autistic people, and each group is like really good at understanding people in their own group, but coordinating with them socially, and sort of appreciating the norms, but not with people from the other group. And I think that was encouraged by a lot of the like sort of symmetry talk.
Yeah, right. The double empathy stuff. Yeah.
Sometimes it seemed like there's one group that's really good at understanding each other and coordinating socially, and then this other group that's sort of chaotic. And different and not, in that group. And I wondered, like, which of those is...
Yeah, right. No, that's a totally fair question because I definitely oversimplified that for purposes of getting through the talk. That's true. So first of all, I think I only believe in neurotypical people as a regulative ideal. However, I strongly believe in neurotypical culture. So I think neurotypical culture is a very real thing. And I think that there is a continuum of how well people fit into that. And I think, so I'm indirectly answering your question. I know I haven't gotten there yet, but I will. I do think, I don't believe that these conditions like autism and ADHD are natural kinds, which really isn't surprising because I really don't think hardly anything is a natural kind. But what I do think is that for the moment, they are useful enough clusters of correlated behavior, symptoms, attentional patterns, and so on, that it is useful for us right now to be able to say, yeah, you're deep enough in that cluster that you are an autistic person, and you over here, even though you may have like some commonalities with that, you're not deep enough in that cluster to be an autistic person. So I think it's still a useful category, but not one that maps onto a natural kind. And I think that in the fullness of time, I think that these diagnostic categories are changing really rapidly, and we're already seeing that. And in the fullness of time, we're going to have a different typography, which is probably going to be more fine-grained, and some things that were formerly separate will overlap, and other things will be pulled out, and we'll have a different categorization. The reason I'm saying this in answer to your question is because if I'm right about that, then it would be very weird if like all autistic people understood all other autistic people perfectly, because I don't actually think they all belong to a natural kind, right? And same for neurotypical people, because neurotypical people are actually just like a loosely held together, also usually at least somewhat bunch of weirdos, just not, right? What it does seem like is that people who fall more on the neurotypical side find certain forms of social interaction very smooth and non-disruptive most of the time, and then when they try to have them with autistic people, it falls apart. And the frustration and social anxiety and constant feeling of not being understood and always feeling like you're getting it wrong that autistic people have when they try to talk to neurotypical people, they don't tend to have when they talk to other autistic people. But again, there's different kinds of autistic people, and it's not like every autistic person like jives with every other autistic person. That's like much too simple. But there's more and more evidence that autistic people tend to, at a certain point, go, wait a minute, maybe everybody's autistic because all my friends are autistic. And it's not because everybody's autistic. It's because they've gravitated towards those people and they can communicate with those people. Or like there are fields, which, frankly, philosophy is one, where there are so many autistic people and neurodivergent people that have gathered because it's a very relatively comfortable home, right? That you start to feel like, oh, well, maybe everybody's kind of neurodivergent, but there's like a huge amount of selection bias. And the way that we understand each other in philosophy talks and in question and answer periods oftentimes is pretty neurodivergent, right? And like when people from other fields hear us, they're shocked at the way we engage with each other along all kinds of lines. You all know what I'm talking about, right? So again, it's a continuum. I'm not saying everybody in this room is autistic. I'm just saying autistic people tend to gravitate towards each other and towards neurotypical people who are more in that direction, and then there's less of a communication breakdown than there is when we go to the Department of Motor Vehicles or whatever. So yes, you're right. It's much, much messier than I said. But I do think that there's a core there where the diagnostic categories are looking at it through a very specific lens and just seeing what is in fact a mismatch as a disorder or a defect of people on one half of that mismatch.
Thanks for the talk. Hi.
Hi.
I'm sitting here. I think I have a follow-up to the medication question. Yeah. I take it that many people are happy that health insurance pays for ADHD medication. So is it an implication of your argument that health insurances shouldn't actually pay?
I have a whole other paper on this. No, and this is really hard. Okay, I always need to think carefully about how I want to answer this question because this is really hard. Because we can't have health insurance systems that pay for everything that makes anybody happier or just like that's not economically sustainable, right? So we need some standards for deciding what health insurance should pay for. I think it's an interesting fact that in pretty much every country, except the United States, kind of, right? We sort of take it for granted that the government or the society owes us financial support for our health needs in a way that it doesn't for our other needs, right? Like that's already interesting. I'm not sure why that should be. So health insurance will pay for even very minor health needs, and something else which is really central to flourishing, we don't have insurance for. So in my ideal utopia, I don't know exactly how this would work, but we wouldn't have health insurance so much as we would have well-being insurance. And the measure would be more, how central is this to this person's well-being that they have access to this? Given that we don't have that, I think that we have to just sort of bite the bullet and recognize that terms like health and disease get used strategically in ways that are not reconcilable with one another. Right? And what it means to call something a health condition or a disease in the context of clinical care versus in the context of pharmaceutical marketing versus in the context of scientific grant getting versus in the context of insurance claims are all very different, and I don't think they're consistent with one another. They just aren't. And so it may well be that at this moment in history, our best approach to taking care of an important well-being need is for us strategically in the context of insurance to push this as a health need. But I don't think that that gets at some deep truth about it, because I don't think there is a deep truth of the matter. I think that these notions of health and disease are fundamentally pluralistic and pragmatic and get pushed in different ways for different purposes. But it's hard, yeah. I mean, we could have this same conversation and it would go a very similar way if we were talking about gender-affirming care, for example. I also don't think that being trans is it's not a disease or a health disorder, but we've had to frame it that way in order to get access to care, and that's complicated, it just is, yeah.
The next question is in the back.
Yeah.
Over there.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks so much. That was wonderful, and I learned a lot. I have a question about the health part as well, so I think I agree with you that autism and ADHD do not necessarily have to be thought of in terms of health. I think that makes sense. I'm just wondering, you don't want to make that point just because it's a true point, right? I thought you would want to make it because there's some sort of political impetus behind it. And I was wondering if this is so, if that really does work, because imagine that the discussions parents have with the doctors of their kids go like that. So let us do these horrible interventions, not because it makes your kid healthy, but because it makes it function better in the society, shitty though it is set up right now, but it makes them function better. I'm not quite sure if, I think that would have some sort of pull on me still.
You mean, so you're talking specifically about ABA, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. Am I still on? I'm still on, right? Yeah. It's an empirical question. I believe that, this is the part of the talk I didn't give, but I believe that healthism is a very powerful ideology in our society. And when you frame something as a health issue, there's this very strong ideology that kicks in that says you're not allowed to not take responsibility for it, and you're not allowed to not care about it, right? We see this get used in all sorts of questionable ways, right? People will use this as a weapon against overweight people. They'll say oh, it's just you're making yourself unhealthy, right? And therefore you have to do something about it. We see this in all, healthy eating is a huge place where all of this stuff that is not in any clear way connected to health gets all of this moral energy cathected onto it under the name of health. So I think that when you say to a parent, your kid has a health problem, they have a devastating disease. Remember, that's the phrase from all of these papers, right? They have a devastating disease, and this is the gold standard treatment for that disease. That has a very specific weight with people. It may be that if you say, this is the way to get your kid to be conformist and normal, that would also have weight. My intuition is that it wouldn't have as much weight, or that there would be more people who felt at least entitled to stand up against it and say, well, maybe let's wait and see how my kid is doing and whether they're flourishing in life and whether they want to be more conformist. Maybe not. It might be culturally variable too. I'm not sure. But I feel like we have more room in society for saying, yeah, okay, this person is sort of quirky and not going to fit in, than we have for saying they have an untreated health condition, right? And we've seen shifts like this. It used to be, a really good example is, up until quite recently, like 2006, it was the absolute standard of care that if an intersex baby was born, they were, before the parents even really had time to know what was going on, they were surgically altered to make their genitals conform, right? And usually to a female, because that's easier to surgically produce. And the official justification for this was not that they had a health problem, but that their life would be so incredibly miserably difficult if they did not gender conform in any neat way, right? And if they were sort of gender disruptive, that we were saving them the misery of this by surgically altering them. And now that is not the standard of care anymore, right? Now we believe that the mere fact of being gender nonconforming is not in and of itself a reason to do major non-consensual surgery on a baby that often had other, functional side effects. So I do think we're moving in the direction of thinking that like nonconformity per se is not necessarily such an emergency, but when you call something a health thing, then it becomes an emergency. I think. Empirical question, yeah.
The next question is in the center here, behind the microphones.
Yeah, hi. Sorry about the eye thing. Oh, I can't hear you at all. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I have a question about your distinction between clock and crib time.
Yeah.
I agree that we all need to have a shared clock. Eventually, we can work together. But I wonder whether we want to keep the shared clock being the clock time currently. Because a lot of times we typically say the clock time is currently structuring our time, is particularly a capitalistic one, and one that is Eurocentric as well. And I think people of different kinds, suffering different kinds of social marginalization, talks about how they're out of joint with the particular clock time.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you say that last sentence again? I just didn't hear last.
People of different kinds of social marginalization talk about being out of joint with clock time. Like people joke about being on black time, on queer time, when they're being systematically late. So I wonder to kind of take seriously the kind of epistemic advantage of neurodivergent people in understanding ideological distortions, whether we want to transform our shared clock at the same time and how we think we can do so.
I think, so I'm sorry, because of the mic I had a tiny bit of trouble hearing, but I think the question, if I heard it right, tell me if this is a fair rephrasing, is that it's not just neurodivergent people who have this distance from clock time, that this is something that's been talked about in the context of, for example, black time and so forth. And so clock time doesn't necessarily have the sort of absolute hegemony that I'm claiming that it has. Is that the question?
Sorry. Yeah, and more specifically, a lot of times we'll see this particular clock time as structuring broader kinds of like oppression, like capitalism, like racism and colonialism and so forth.
Right.
So I wonder whether you would, like, for example, how you would see our relationship with time itself can be a source of political and structural change.
Yeah, I love this question. I actually just had a wonderful conversation about this in another context. It's a great question. So yeah, it's certainly not only neurodivergent people who are out of step with clock time, and you're absolutely right, in particular, that like there's a lot of both playful and serious discourse, right, around different cultures having different pacings and black time being a thing. I guess black Twitter doesn't exist anymore because it was completely taken over by like weird right-wingers, but like there used to be black Twitter, which was really fun, which had lots of jokes about this. And I think that there's also a big movement in both the Black and the disability communities to talk about reclaiming rest and slowness as political acts, as resistance against clock time. So there's lots of directions from which clock time is a very bad fit, and also from which it's being pushed back on and challenged. I hadn't actually thought that much about the colonialism one, but you're of course exactly right that this is one of the ways that colonial discourse enforces various kinds of harmful racism, is by framing the people being colonized as in need of being disciplined into clock time from the point of view of the colonizers, right? And it's a way of portraying people as like lazy or savage or unproductive, whatever it may be. So I think that's a really important point. So yeah, I think that what I'm doing, you're absolutely right, is part of a much larger story about how badly three things. How badly clock time fits a lot of people. Secondly, the way that it's used, it's treated as descriptive, but is actually used as a prescriptive weapon of discipline, right? And there's lots of different corners from which there's resistance to it that we can find. So yeah, mostly I just want to agree with you. But I mean, I think that part of what's important is like, yeah, we need some of that choreography of attention. We need some clock time going to get a bunch of stuff done. Like this conference would not happen if a lot of people hadn't been able to stay on clock time enough to like coordinate it and do it. So it's not all bad. But we need to also see the ways in which stuff that doesn't fit into that model is not necessarily just like a failure or disruptive. It's a source of other kinds of temporality, other kinds of creativity, other kinds of insight that we don't get. And yeah, it's not just neurodivergent people. I told this story recently, but one of the big moments of awakening for me about this isn't so much about clock time, but about what I think of as pace bias. The assumption that there's something wrong with you if you're not on the sort of same pace as everybody else, is when I started graduate school, there was a guy in my graduate program who was the slowest paced person I had ever met in my entire life. He was from the southern United States. He was like 450 pounds, whatever that is, like over 200 kilograms. And he was just like this big, everything he said, I'm not even gonna be able to bring myself to do it, but like, you gotta imagine, it was all like, well, I think, it's just like incredibly slow. And it took him like 11 years to finish his PhD. And when I got there as like, this like Northeast Jewish person who was very fast-paced, and it always, everybody valued fast-paced, I honestly just assumed, this is confessional time, I assumed he was really stupid. And after about a year of being in the program with him, I realized he was arguably the smartest person in my graduate program. And that the pace was just absolutely irrelevant to the quality of his contributions or the depth of his thought. And it was a real eye-opener for me, But that's a very hard lesson for us. There's people who are differently paced or on different temporalities doing all kinds of cool things. And pace bias is a thing that it's very, very hard to get past. Like I said, even in terms of our own internalization, if we don't keep up with the pace that's been given to us, we feel like failures, and that's really hard to get past. But yes, great question, great point.
So we have 3 more questions on my list.
Okay, I'll go fast. This is my being bad with clock time.
And the next question is here in the...
Yeah, hi.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for your great talk. I found your criticism of the DSM and the general description of autism very convincing, and also, of course, the criticism of the ABA. But I think there is one point in your talk where I thought that there might be a way of thinking of at least some cases of autism still as a health problem in the sense you highlighted, because on one slide, where you differentiated between the different types of attention capacities, you specifically stated that people with autism are unable to engage in this interest space or have very little capacity for needs-based attention, and that even if they really want them to, they cannot be motivated by these punishment and rewards. And so I thought, here, it's not just mere difference, right? But it's a lack of ability compared to other people, which is tied to promoting their own interests, which they're unable to do. And so I thought, maybe that could be a kernel.
Okay,
where
but here's the
health,
thing.
Problem could come in.
Yeah. The thing is, like, I started off by saying it's definitely a disability, right? Because it definitely comes with disadvantages. I don't think all disabilities and disadvantages are health problems. And the thing is, I don't think anybody in this room can honestly say to yourself that you are totally happy with your ability to control your attention the way you want to control it. Right? Maybe there are some of you who are just like super good at that. But generally speaking, right? So yes, it is true that it is often frustrating for ADHD people and autistic people to be so interest-driven and to not be able to crank up the needs-driven when they want it. But I know people on the other side too. I know people who are so unable to stop attending to the consequences of what they're going to do and all the stuff they have to do and what's, what needs to be done and what's going to happen, that they can't get interested in the moment, that they can't let the things that actually engage them fill their attention. And they wish they could, and it makes them unhappy. I mean, this isn't even that weird of an experience, right? I mean, you're like at whatever, you're at a concert or you're at the beach and you're like, why can't I be in this? Why am I thinking about the fact that I have to do these 12 things later or I'm going to be in trouble? So yeah, it's a sub-ideal thing that we're not all perfectly agentially in control of our own attention. That's true. And I also think that autistic people tend to have more of a imbalance than most people, and that's a disability of a sort. But I don't think that makes it a health problem. I think it just makes it a difference that can be a disadvantage. And I think that bad things happen when we start thinking of all disadvantages and all differences under a health framing. So yes, it's true. It can be very frustrating. But my two take-homes are almost everybody has some amount of that kind of frustration. And I don't see that as a reason to count it as a health matter. Yeah, hi.
Hi, cool. Is this on?
I can hear you, but I don't know if anybody else can.
Okay, sorry.
Oh,
thanks for the talk. I'm following up on the earlier question about the sort of typology you've drawn between neurodivergent and non-neurodivergent people.
Right.
When distinguishing the two, you talk a bit about the built environment and how things like having a trampoline around will stop the tendency to self-harm.
Yeah.
In the American educational system, typically classrooms aren't divided between neurodivergent and non-neurodivergent by levels of ability, right? So more like AP computer science might have a lot more neurodivergent people than a standard classroom, whereas the special needs class might also have a lot more autistic people.
Right.
Would you advocate for divvying up based on neurodiversity and non-neurodiversity so that students are served in they're in a room where they have the capacity to stim, to do things that they might feel serve their attention better, rather than on, let's say, like this abilities-based model that we typically see?
Yeah, this is an incredibly hard question because, I mean, we have on our hands here, this is actually a good last question. Let me answer this one. Is it okay? Do we have time? Okay, I'll go fast then. It's just I have a lot to say about this, but I'll try to condense it. We have on our hands here a really seriously interesting architectural and design problem, right? Which is that universal design is a myth, right? There is no environment that can accommodate everybody's different needs and everybody's different forms of attention. It's also true that we tend to go to the other extreme and we tend to create these incredibly rigid educational spaces, and then our fix for that, for their incredible rigidity, is either to section off like the disruptive problem people and put them somewhere else, even though their needs may not correspond either, right? Some people are stimming, whereas other people are in sensory overwhelm because of the stimming, right? Or we try to accommodate them in the regular classroom by instead of just actually incorporating them and making the classroom accessible, bringing in all these artificial things like aids and stuff that make them feel really weird and wedging them into that classroom and trying our best to hold them in that really rigid environment. I think these are all really bad solutions. Do I know what the best solution is? No, but we need way more flexible spaces, and we need people to be able to move between spaces, not based on their formal diagnoses, but based on what actually works for them. So not special needs versus normal, but some kids are gonna work better in the noisier classroom, and some kids are gonna work better in the quieter classroom, and some kids need to sit on a couch, and some kids do well behind a desk. And I feel like we just should be building more flexible spaces and worrying less about the diagnosis and more about who does well in what kind of space. But that's a tall order. Yeah.
So this is going to be the final question.
Yeah, no problem.
In the back.
Hello.
I get the last one. It scares me a bit. Thank you for your talk. I know we wanted to get away from the high and low functioning, but it's also let's stick with the contextual functioning, but for some, and I'm going to talk about children here, they have it much harder than other, even within the neurodiverse thing. And the connection between the parents and the children is specifically hard. And for some, that even means they can't really get into contact. And for the parent-child relationship, framing it as a health issue very often brings the advantage of, specifically for the mothers, not being the one who's morally blamed anymore, and also for their children, not being taken as a moral failure anymore. And I totally get the point that you want to get away from the ABA because clearly the community has it all right. It's bad. It's some kind of normative pressure and even violence that's going on. But I lacked a little bit of like an alternative treatment plan that would be good for very hard cases, which would guide parents and children, and not just push them into that kind of like, oh, everybody's different. Maybe just go online and look on TikTok what the community says, and then try to figure out how your child is an individual. It seems to be putting too much pressure also again on the parents and the individual child on figuring. Is it a little bit clear? I think we can get a better treatment plan. And maybe stick a little bit with like, there could be some general health guidelines, and you even named some because the community is developing some. Instead of just going completely away from it and be like, okay, let's figure this out on the go.
Okay, so like I don't want to count the trampoline and the noise canceling headphones as like health interventions, but I think they're super useful. I do agree that we have created this culture where parents are like to blame if their children are disruptive, basically, or high support needs, right? They get held accountable for that. I think that, so like, for example, I didn't really understand until quite recently that so-called nonverbal autistic people are often extremely verbal if they use alternative devices, right? I mean, we have these stereotypes of nonverbal autistic people as people who basically there's just no hope of ever getting to them and whatever. But it turns out that nonverbal autistic people, when given the right kinds of devices and the right kind of training, can actually produce amazing text and have lots to say. So we need to be more creative about how to engage and support so-called high support needs people. I don't, again, think that it is especially helpful to think of that under a health framing, particularly. But another thing is, like, a hard thing for us to accept is that there are some people in the world, and most autistic people are not like this, but there's a non-trivial minority of autistic people in the world who actually don't want a lot of human connection or hardly any human connection. And like, that's okay. Like, it makes neurotypical people uncomfortable, but it's actually okay if somebody just doesn't want that, right? Like, just like a small but non-trivial percentage of people are asexual, and that's very weird to the rest of people who think of sex as like this super important part of a flourishing life. It's actually fine that they're asexual. And this is a hard thing for us to accept, but there are going to be some autistic people who don't want social connection. And what do we owe those people? We owe them care and the conditions to have a flourishing life, and maybe not so much relentless trying to train them and force them into being people who have connection, right? So it's some combination of stop acting like it's parents' responsibility to make their kids be non-disruptive and normal, plus get much more creative about the kinds of supports that we can give people that will help them lead a flourishing life, and they don't necessarily have to look like health treatments, and being accepting of the fact that things that are incredibly important and dear to us, like our social connections to our friends, just might not be important to 100% of the population, and that's something that is not necessarily to be pathologized. Yeah.
Okay, please join me in thanking again our first keynote speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you.